Hello there. In this video, I'll do two ways of analyzing and outlining of an English language and literature paper 1. The exam paper that I will present is the newest 2023 May exam one. Specifically, it is from TZ1 written text. I hope this outlining practice can give you an insight on your English A revision, especially on finding your best fit of essay structuring. Then let's give it a go. In this video, I will focus on analyzing and outlining only the question number 1, which is this written text. So if we check the guiding information, following transcript is from the podcast, The Happiness Lab, hosted by Dr. Laurie Santos, Professor of Psychology at Yale University. And here we've got some basic information about the podcast, and following content are script. The conversation between the Professor Santos and his colleague, who is going to be another professor, Jamil Zaki. Yes. If we check the guiding question, it asks how and what effect is empathy presented in the text. The very first way I'm going to compose my essay is that I'm going to focus on the way that the value is presented, focusing on features of value. Anywho, what must be done even before that is to fill out the intro content. Present, I identify the source of this text, which is a transcript from the podcast thingy that I've read. Target audience, obviously, broadly English speakers, but more specifically, podcast content consumers who are interested in the content on mental health or well-being in general, I want to say. Third purpose, I can identify that as to underline the indispensable value of empathy, which currently diminishes its stance. Thesis. Through the podcast conversation, the professors present the worth of empathy, especially via analyzing its stance from the multiple facets. First feature of the value empathy being presented in this conversation, how do I define? I define this as empathy as a type of value that loses its stance in contemporary society. That's the first definition that I want to point out. Use the evidence of personal account that I brought from the professor's account. He himself found out that the things were like losing or things are changing dramatically, blah, blah, blah. The second evidence that I'm going to use to support the first feature is the metaphor. I felt like I was being a Pollyanna and giant tire fire, two of the metaphors. The last evidence that I would love to present is the logos. Second feature that I've defined when it comes to figuring out the stance of the value empathy from the conversation is that empathy is a type of value that being misunderstood amongst the people. First evidence that I would love to support the second featuring of the value empathy is that the professors are using pronoun we somehow to embrace the misunderstandings that we normally have when it comes to defining the value. I would love to focus on the critical use of diction, such as quintessential act of self-sacrifice. We tend to define empathy as a quintessential act of self-sacrifice. However, the professor wanted to say it's not the case. Last evidence to point out the misconception about the value empathy is irony. It turns out, though, that the data point almost exactly in the opposite direction. All these three evidences can support the idea that we are having sort of wrongly defined idea about the value. So maybe that's the reason we are losing it. Last way that I could define the feature of the value from the conversation is that empathy is a value that must be more highly appreciated with its precious worth. Then I need to find the evidences from the conversation transcript saying that how worthwhile the value is. So the first evidence that I found is the comparison. People who experience a lot of empathy also tend to be happier, less stressed, and experience less depression. What a good evidence. Also, there is an ethos. He conducted a classroom assignment that tested students to try some empathetical conversation. So that could be an evidence of supporting the value of the empathy. Also, there is a linguistic device assonance, the repetition of ing. I told my student instead of yelling at each other, judging each other, or even debating. Unfortunately, this is the commonly spotted way of having conversations with those who have different opinion of us, right? So the professor wanted to somehow denounce such attitude and somehow embrace or encourage the empathetic way of conversation. Last evidence that will help to support my third feature is the imperative sentence that the presenters are using. I want you to try to cultivate curiosity about each other. So that's kind of like very strong and very directive. Therefore, the listeners can be somehow motivated and encouraged to somehow change their attitude and apply this method when it comes to having conversation. In conclusion, what do I do? I'm going to put some evaluation on this conversation. It would have been much better and logically understandable if the professors could put some explanations or analysis on the reason why we have lost empathy in the first place. Like why? Because it's the social reason, economic reason, or cultural reasons, or is it inevitable, or is it avoidable, or things like that, right? Then the listeners can be more related to find the origin of this symptom. Within the same logic, one more evaluation that I would love to put is that how can we recover or strengthen empathy in real life outside of the classroom? Wouldn't it be much better if the conversation provides more practical ways to embrace empathy in real life, like not within the limited classroom setting? So my last question was like this: just having curiosity is the only answer, like real practical answer to raise our awareness on the importance of empathy? Is that all? So maybe the conversation would be much more relatable and thoughtful if the solution was a bit more pragmatic in real life setting. Yeah, this is the first way of outlining the given written text, which focused on features of the value presented in the conversation. Then with the very same text, what's the alternative way of outlining the people one essay? I'm thinking of the second way as focusing on the linguistic features being used. As always, the intro contents are first presented, the same contents that are identified. The only difference is the thesis. The thesis that I composed says, through the podcast conversation, the professors present the worth of empathy via the usage of colorful tone, body 1, language, body 2, and structure, body 3, to strengthen the persuasiveness of the idea. So according to the different body styles, thesis must be changed. My first body would identify the colorful tones being used in this conversation. So body 1, tone. First type of tone that we can easily spot is colloquial tone. Hey, you can choose empathy. The professors are having casual conversation throughout the podcast because the nature of the medium is having such casuality in the first place. So that's the one thing that we can say. Second one is imperative tone, because they need to persuade the listeners to change their attitude. Last, I want to say the conversation also includes informative tone as well, since they are professors, they're experts in the field, so they need to somehow deliver the persuasiveness through some convincing evidences. Second body paragraph is going to focus on its language devices. So metaphor, which I've already mentioned, giant tire fire, or I felt like I was being a Pollyanna. Pronoun we. Diction. Diction. Irony. Ethos. All we have to do after figuring out these details is to relate that to the effect that the listeners are getting from listening to this conversation. Last, I would love to point out the way that the conversation is structured. The conversation starts with sharing the professor's own account and also accounting some common mood that we all feel regarding the empathy, which is being neglected and denounced by us. Followingly, the conversation goes to point out the misconception regarding empathy, and the conversation starts to promote the value of having empathy with much more logical evidences. At the end of the conversation, I'm not sure if it is the real end of the podcast. I think it's just a part of script. However, I want to say, lastly, the conversation finishes with underlining the attitude we should have. Conclusion, which should include the reprating thesis and the evaluation, are the same. I still have same evaluation on the conversation. Yes, all right. This is the end of the alternative way of outlining Paper 1 essay with this podcast transcript. And the last job left is to use all these details to compose a decent Paper 1 essay. All right, this is the end of the work. If you have come this much far to check the analyzing and outlining of the given Paper 1 text, thank you so much. I hope it will be a bit of help when it comes to making your English revision more productive. Then I will see you with more of the English A revision videos anytime soon. Thank you. Bye.